My name is Patty Brennan. I'm the director of the National Library of Medicine, and I am absolutely delighted today to introduce you to Amanda Rinehart, who is the Life Sciences Librarian and Associate Professor for the Department of Research and Education, the University Libraries at The Ohio State University. You got to meet Ms. Rinehart a little bit a few weeks ago when she contributed a blog posting to Musings on the Mezzanine. So if you haven't seen it yet, please take a look. Ms. Rinehart started her career not as a librarian, but as a biologist. She spent about 11 years with the Department of Agriculture, testing alternative to agricultural methods to reduce human impact on climate. As a librarian, she continues her interest in data, defined broadly as a heterogeneous collection of information used for research purposes. In her role at the Ohio State University, Ms. Rinehart is stimulating the idea of data use as a critical role for librarians and for all parties interested in research. She holds a Master of Science from the School of Information at the University of South Florida and a Master of Science in Botany and Plant Biology from the University of Michigan State. From Michigan State University. Got that one a little bit confused. I apologize. Today, Ms. Rinehart is here to deliver the Joseph Leiter Lecture, which is a collaborative activity between the NLM and the MLA. I was privileged to deliver this lecture a few years ago. It's been around for almost 40 years, designed to stimulate the intellectual liaison between our two important groups. Joseph Leiter, for those of you who did not know him, began his career as a chemist. He worked at NCI for many years and eventually served as the assistant chief of the cancer chemotherapy unit. Once he retired from that unit in around 1965, Marty Cummings recruited Dr. Leiter to join the National Library of Medicine to become our Associate Director for Library of Operations. In part due to his experience in building electronic data processing systems for NCI, Dr. Leiter brought to us this vision of how electronic processing could assist in our efforts. Additionally, though, he helped to expand the regional medical libraries. He envisioned uses of the citation number as a quick way for locating citations, and he rejuvenated our NLM Associates program. The title of Ms. Rinehart's lecture today is Data Communities, Room for Everyone, Role for Librarians. We're delighted to have you here. Welcome.
Thank you so much. It's my honor to present the Leiter Lecture this year. So the title of my talk today is Data Communities, Room for Everyone, Roles for Librarians. But before I get started, I'd like just to give you a couple of options to interact. So I have set up a little website that you can enter comments in, and you can either type in this address manually or on the page where you got to this video cast. There's also a link there that you can click, or there's a QR code here that you can use. And I've set up the web page with just 3 quick questions about data communities and your experience. I'd love to hear back from you, but it is certainly no obligation. Feel free to take a minute and navigate to that. I'll leave you this up for just a few seconds, and I'll put this slide up at the end as well. And if you would like to give us feedback as we go, you can use this email here, the NLM Leiter Lecture at mail.nih.gov, to ask questions or give us feedback. So I'm going to talk for 45 minutes, and then I'm hoping that we can have some dialogue at the end. So why data communities? Why am I talking about this particular phrase? And the reason is data really, when we talk about data, we tend to talk about the technical side, and that's very natural. That's understandable. A lot of working with data is very technical in nature. A lot of our lives are very technical in nature at this point. And so it's natural to go right there. But there are these tensions between the social side, sort of the squishy soft side of data, and then the technical side of data. And I feel like the social side is a little bit neglected. So I wanted to take today and talk about the social side of data, because I don't think these factors can be separated. And I tend to like a lot of quotes from other people. So I will put them up here, and hopefully they will inspire you to go look up where they're from. The way I've structured today's talk is I'm going to talk a little bit about what we mean by data communities in the past, why they're important, sort of different definitions of what a data community is. Then I'm going to use COVID-19 to look at our data communities and how they've changed in our present, because we've had a lot of radical change facilitated by COVID-19. And then do a little bit of speculation on our future, what might be important, and what roles librarians could play if they'd like, in particular on the social side of data. And I do focus on research data sharing. Every once in a while, I'll expand a little bit into business and commercial data, but most of this will be talking about research data products. So a little bit about me. Dr. Brennan did a brief overview, but I'll just reiterate, I did not start out as a librarian. I started out as a researcher at the USDA. That's me there in one of our labs with my former supervisor behind me, Dr. Burrell. And I'm looking at some eggplant plants, and I'm looking at the roots to rate them for a certain disease, and I loved it, and I did that for about 11 years. And then over in the other picture is me currently, and you can't really tell, but behind me there is all kinds of preservation, conservation equipment, and manuscripts. So I became a librarian kind of accidentally in some ways. It's been wonderful and definitely the right change for me, but I do carry a lot of my first career with me. So what I learned in that first career around data was really significant to how I approach data today. In the year 2000, when I started out working for the USDA, we probably had on average about 12 people in our labs. And we did agricultural research. It's very slow to replicate a study. You have to wait for the next year and put it in the field again. And it's a very arduous, high intensive activity. So we'd have on average about 12 people, and we'd produce maybe 2 gigabytes of data. So that data is really valuable, really important. Fast forward a decade, and we had a vast rebalancing of how many people we needed and how much data we were producing. As technology became more affordable and just better, we had little tiny weather stations that were, throwing out data all the time, and microclimates. We had robots in the lab that was throwing out data. So I didn't need so many people. I needed higher skilled people, just 2 or 3, and we could put out about 6 times as much data. So just when people say that we have more data now than ever, or the velocity of data has increased, when you live it, it's astonishing how fast your needs change around this world and how difficult it is as a researcher to keep up with it. And I think agriculture might have actually been a little behind everyone else in some ways. So I just did a rough cut. I went into Medline, searched for articles that were talking about data, and I separated them by decade and mapped it out here. And you can see that in the 50s and 60s, there was a little bit of a hump where people were interested in data, but really the 90s, it took off. In the 90s, just data started to really come up as a topic in research, and it just started to really demand attention from the researchers. So it's no surprise then that in the 2000s, the funding agencies started coming out with policies around data, right? There was more of it than ever. It was more difficult to handle. We needed different skill sets in analyzing and presenting it. So in 2003, NIH had their first data sharing policy. It only applied to $500,000 and up, so it was fairly limited. And then in 2011, the National Science Foundation comes out with their data management plan. And then by 2014-16, there's not even enough room on the slide to put all the acronyms of all the agencies that had some kind of policy around data and how to address it. In fact, most of the private funders also jumped on board during that time. So if you were getting funding to do research, you suddenly had data issues on the side of production and handling it, but you also had data issues on your funding side of how to meet new expectations and requirements. And then of course in 2023, we have a new NIH data management and sharing policy coming into effect. So I became a librarian in 2011, right as this National Science Foundation data management plan dropped. And I became a data librarian. At that point in time, it was called an e-sciences librarian. And the first question that I was facing with researchers was, what is this data that they want, right? Like what constitutes data? Even getting a definition of what do we mean by the data was very controversial. So their number one frequently asked question on their page was, what constitutes the data? And the answer said it would be determined by the communities of interest. And that was not super helpful in clarifying that. So the second questions researchers had after what is data is, well, who are these communities? who's judging me? Who's judging my data handling? Who wants my data? For many, many research cultures, including the one that I came from, sharing data was not the norm. It was never an expectation that people outside of your research group or even outside of you were ever going to really look at your data. The article, yes, the article was supposed to be published, people would review it, but not your data set. That was a much more private concept and still is in many ways. So these communities of interest, suddenly everybody's like, what is the community? I'm going to simplify that question to what is a data community, and I think we don't really have good consensus on this yet, but we're narrowing in on it. So I want to throw out a couple of definitions just so you can get your feet wet with the idea. The first person that started looking at data communities that I came across was Carol Tenepier and her co-authors. They did a number of studies that looked at scientists and their practices and behaviors around data. And this particular chart here, it's really just to demonstrate that they looked at them according to discipline. So in my world, my academic world, where we have people separated into nice departments and colleges, that's what we call their discipline. And you can see from this chart, the environmental science people and the ecologists are much more willing to share their data than, say, the engineering people who are at the bottom of the chart. This was tremendously useful information for me because my clientele will separate out according to these disciplines, and I have listservs that match, exactly what these are. So if I'm talking to the ecologists, I can be relatively assured that they're going to be more open to data services than maybe the engineering people are. And I thought for this audience, the most interesting bit of some of those studies that were done was that biomedicine is actually pretty similar to business and psychology in some ways, and that these disciplines do not wish to share their data. And it's probably because of human subjects, right? It may also be because of potential commercialization. Both working with human subjects makes sharing data a little bit more difficult, as well as if you're going to commercialize something, you don't want to share your data and invalidate your patent ability. So in particular, in medicine and health sciences, this is a little bit trickier maybe than in some of the other research fields. So then, it's convenient for me to look at data sharing practices by discipline, but when I actually work with researchers and my personal experience being a researcher, it doesn't really quite match up to a data community. That's not necessarily the community that's interested in any particular data set. So when we look at people who are really good at sharing data, that have had data repositories for quite some time, we find that sometimes they're arranged around discipline, but sometimes they're not. So ICPSR is a very large social science data repository established in 1962, really well known and honest. They have a fantastic data management manual, by the way, for preparing social science data. And if you think of social science as a really, really broad discipline, yeah, that's a disciplinary community there. So that one might be a discipline-centric data community. But then you get to something like Cambridge Crystallographic Data Center, and they only focus on crystal structures, which is actually dependent upon a file type, a very specific kind of file type. So that data community, that repository, is really more oriented towards a file type as opposed to a departmental discipline. And then you get something like the National Snow and Data, an ICE data center, and they ignore both sort of our traditional discipline categories and file type. They're interested in any data from frozen parts of the earth. So this could be seismographs, it could be satellite data, it could be anthropology data on the communities that live on the frozen parts of the earth. So when we talk about a data community, it doesn't really map directly to discipline in many ways, but it doesn't really map to data to file types either. And I think in GenBank, which is the DNA genetic sequences that are publicly available, yes, everyone there might be working with DNA, but I think you'd be hard pressed to get everyone who submits to GenBank and works with GenBank data as thinking that they're in the same data community. So we're struggling a little bit with sort of how to get data community scoped and nailed down. So the first time I really saw people in the information professions approach this topic and really say, look, we'd like to understand what data communities are doing, is an NSF-funded endeavor done by the Data Curation Network and Ithaca SNR. And this is a relatively recent effort. And one of their objectives was to test the data communities framework, which is essentially to try and leverage these groups of people, which means to some extent defining these groups of people, to move this research data sharing forward. And I should emphasize there are other objectives of this study that I just didn't put up on this slide, but it's worth it to go read about. One of the things I really like about the Leveraging Data Communities effort is that they are starting from the bottom and building up the concepts around data sharing. So instead of sort of the build it and they will come, which has been a lot of the approach for very reasonable reasons, this particular effort is really going to the researchers themselves and talking to the researchers and then building services up around that. And their first take on a data community is this definition of a fluid and informal network of researchers who share and use a certain type of data. So to me, that definition almost becomes the data community is the research group. And I do like that. I think that we're getting closer maybe to what a data community definition is. But I should point out that this phrase, data communities, has also arisen in other areas of our world outside of academia, outside of research. In particular, in the business community, a data community can mean a very specific type of idea. And I kind of like this definition, or I like it and I hate it. It's basically that data communities are specialized communities made up of organizations that have data and organizations that want data, tied together based on intent-driven use of the data. And the emphasis on these quotes is mine. So I love the intent-driven use of the data. I think that really resonates with me. On the other hand, it's pretty transactional about organizations that want data and organizations have data. I think that's much more of the commercial take on it. So that's a little bit about the past and sort of the phrase data community, why researchers can get really stressed about it, because if data communities are judging them, but we can't even define them, how are we supposed to wrestle with this? And various different definitions. This is an evolving field, so I fully expect in the next few years we'll have different definitions of what a data community is and what they mean to us. I'm going to talk a little bit about COVID-19 in data because I think that is the most illustrative, possibly extreme example of research data sharing and how it has affected us and our culture. And then I'll move on to the future of where we think we're going with this. So the COVID-19 data communities, you know, obviously, as I'm sure everyone is aware, when COVID-19 came up, researchers had to pivot very, very quickly. So data communities, research groups were formed exceptionally quickly. And a lot of the reasons for data sharing that we have talked to people about, you know, a lot of the incentives for data sharing that as a data librarian I have told people really started to be illustrated as true in this circumstance. So a lot of the language around data sharing is, oh, you'll get more citations because more people will use your research and it will accelerate the pace of discovery and push fields forward faster. But these have always been kind of nebulous ideas. They didn't really seem to resonate with researchers. They're like, yeah, okay, but our traditional way works, right? And it's secure. But we see with the COVID-19 data, this first paper is the first release of the genetic sequence of COVID-19. And I pulled off this screenshot 2 days ago. It had 5,922 citations. So I did some rough back of the envelope math, and it was working out to like 5 citations a day. And in a world where your reputation depends on your citations, your promotion still depends on your citations, this is massive. This is massive incentive to share your data if you're going to get that kind of credit. Now, granted, if your data isn't COVID-19 data, you might not so much, but COVID-19 really illustrated that this could be true, as well as the idea that if we didn't do this data sharing, we would not have a vaccine this quickly. We would not have the treatments we have this quickly. And in this particular situation, time was of the essence. And so there is no better illustration of open data sharing and how it's benefiting our society and fulfilling the promise of open science than COVID-19. Now, it's not necessarily easy to do this, though. One of the things that really facilitated open data sharing in COVID-19 is there was actually a statement made by the publishers, funders, and various professional societies that said, look, just share. Share your data, share your articles, share everything. We will not hold it against you. We will not consider that, we're not going to publish your article because you shared your data over here. They really resolved a lot of the concerns or sort of workflow issues around data sharing. And them coming out with this statement and being very public about it, I think really broke down barriers to openly sharing research data. That doesn't mean everything went smoothly, though, unfortunately. So we have a lot of information coming out. We have a lot of people sharing preprints, articles before they're peer-reviewed, sharing data sets. This is a particular scandal around COVID-19 data sets. It was basically a couple of articles that came out and said, based on this proprietary data of from hospitals and from patient studies, we recommend the hydroxychloroquine treatment. And then, of course, these get published in The Lancet and I think the New England Journal of Medicine, so very prestigious journals. And then when people brought up questions about them and attempted to review them, they actually got retracted. The questions were related to this data set, which to this day I don't believe has been resolved as a legitimate data set. And so as a result of this, at least The Lancet has now come out and said, look, when papers like this come up, we're going to have to hire statisticians to review the data, right? It's no longer just considered supplementary to the article. This might be really fundamental and something that we need to have new processes around. So even though it's fulfilling the promise of open science, we still have a lot of work to do in order to make this really work smoothly. The other thing that COVID-19 and sharing data really changed is on the public side of things. I would have never envisioned a world where the Wall Street Journal cared about how scientists were sharing data. And suddenly, it's like we're under the microscope, right, of how you're sharing data, where are files, versioning. This particular article was focused on files that got put up and then taken down and then put up again. And these are not unusual things in a repository of any kind where, for whatever reason, information might be versioned or new files put up, but suddenly we have people like the Wall Street Journal interested, and it's a little bit difficult then to innovate and resolve our issues when you're under the microscope like that. However, there is an upside to it, and part of that upside is that a couple of studies have pointed to the public changing their attitude around sharing their data for research purposes. We've seen that the public give a lot of data to commercial enterprises, including me. You're tracked when you're online and it monitors things and sends you ads and that sort of thing. But it's a little bit more difficult to get data from the public or get the public to be comfortable handing over data for research purposes, for example, for public health purposes. But a couple of studies have been done that say, actually, now that COVID-19 has happened, people are much more open to sharing their personal data with people who are trying to do good. So this is very encouraging, that maybe the silver lining to all the attention that COVID-19 and the data sharing scandals and things have happened. Maybe the silver lining is that we will change some of our ability to get a hold of data that will really help us. So that's where we are in the present. And I will say, I don't think people know, how things are going to shift in the future, if they're going to happen really, if we're going to, see the positive sides. Hang on. I certainly hope that we do. I think that resolving some of our workflow issues around open data sharing, I love that the public is interested personally, because I think that the more people get involved with data, the more you understand it and can make good decisions. So I wanted to, in the future, just speculate a little bit about enduring data issues or new data issues. A couple of roles for librarians. I freely admit this is not comprehensive, given our time constraints and just in general the wide world of data. I limited myself to only talking about 3 topics and only three roles that librarians could play with each topic. So hopefully you will see a lot of potential there. And then a little bit about why a librarian would get involved with data. I think that that is a very legitimate question to ask. And then end with maybe a couple of ideas about how you can get involved if you're not already. Let's see. So the first topic that I think is going to be really important, has been important, but really has elevated in importance is data ethics and trust, right? We have a lot of people working with data, and hopefully I've illustrated that even as a researcher, the landscape changes so fast with the data that you can get and what you need to learn to work with it, that there's not a lot of community norms. I think the best example of this is artificial intelligence. That community that works with artificial intelligence, they've come out with a lot of different statements around ethics around it, in part because there have been a lot of studies that have revealed that artificial intelligence has resulted in a lot of sort of unintended negative consequences, bias, say, in how loans are granted, or even how social media affects us. And these are not necessarily intended. It's not malicious per se. It's because it's an evolving technology, and we need to pay attention to what we do with it, basically. So there's wonderful ethics statements coming out, but a lot of researchers have pointed out that you can have an ethics statement, but if you don't have action around it and accountability, it really kind of doesn't mean anything. So, evolving community norms, making sure that they actually work. Of course, having underrepresented communities both represented in the data sets is important, but also having them have a say about how the data sets about them are represented. I think that is something that has been long neglected. So it's important to reach out to those communities and make sure that they have a say in how data that is taken on them gets out there, how it's interpreted. So in data integrity, provenance, versioning, if that sounds like archives to you, it sure as heck sounds like archives to me. That would have helped with that COVID-19 data scandal. There would have been some assurance that that data set was accurate. And I actually added cybersecurity here, even though I think a lot of people think of cybersecurity as solely the technical side, and certainly there are vast technical sides to it. But it's still hugely about, especially in the research realm, does the researcher know what they're allowed to do with the data? Can you copy that file and take it home for the weekend to run an analysis? What about all those old files on your laptop as you travel around the world to conferences? What do you need to do to make sure the data is safe? So there's still a social side to these topics. So librarian roles in this area, certainly we've been doing information ethics for a long, long time, and data is just another form of information. That the ability for librarians to think, gosh, we can do that with the data, but should we? We ask that a lot with our patron data or circulation data, even how we work in our archives, we attempt to be ethical. So I think that's a strength that librarians bring to the table. We also, and this is going to come up a couple times, librarians sit at the intersection between groups, whether that's groups within your organization or departments, or even interfacing between the library and the researchers. There surprisingly aren't a lot of people that sit in those spaces, and connecting people up, connecting communities up, it can be really important. It seems like it's really small, but just by saying, hey, you're struggling with data ethics and the artificial intelligence people over here have been doing that for a while, why don't you look at some of those? That is tremendously valuable to pushing everyone forward. And last but not least, digital preservation for all of data integrity. If you don't have digital preservation, it's really hard to go back to demonstrate that the data is authentic, which is so important to research reproducibility. So that's just a few ideas out there on data ethics. The next one, I think, in the future that we need to work on is data culture. And I will state right now, the business community has a very specific definition of a data culture as a culture that's data-driven for their decision-making. And I don't disagree with that, but I would like to expand that definition a little farther. It's not just about relying on data to tell us or inform our decisions. A lot of it's about developing behaviors around data, valuing data, using it, understanding it, and writ large, both our organizations and other organizations. A lot of understanding data comes down to the context that is around the data. So the example I use with students is I say, if I tell you the number 72, what does that mean? Well, it doesn't mean anything. It doesn't have a unit on it. It's not telling me 72 what, 72 when, 72 where, right? So librarians fundamentally add context to information. We don't necessarily, interpret it for everyone, although often we do, but just having the appropriate context attached to the data makes it much more understandable. So metadata schema. I mean, something as simple of having all the appropriate fields attached to this data to make it meaningful. Data management and sharing. Who should get access to it when? That's all going to be important to developing appropriate data culture. And then last but certainly not least, we've been teaching information literacy for a long time. How do you tell if this is good data? Should you trust this data for this decision? How important is the information that you're looking for? All of that applies. And I really think, particularly as we come out of this pandemic, we've seen illustrated how difficult it can be for some segments of our society or our culture to really understand data, to understand what's presented to them. And at all levels, in my opinion, we need more education around a data fluent culture. And the third one, it almost killed me to narrow down to three. But the third issue I think that is an enduring challenge is discoverability. If we can't find data or we don't know it exists, we can't have data flow between these silos. And really, it's there's a lot of duplication of data creation, which can be very expensive and just delay us a lot. And so data is a world where there's not really a great index or a great catalog. We don't have a WorldCat for data sets yet. So librarians pull this role of connecting these separate data communities, knowing where you might find the data or knowing what people don't know. So metadata, again, of course, helps for interoperability of technology, connecting these communities, but as well on this one, information searching and retrieval. I think that when you look for data sets, it's a little bit different than looking for articles because we don't have such great indexes and sort of systems set up yet. So a lot of times helping someone find data or making sure their data is findable is really important and a role that is clearly a librarian's strength. So I made myself only talk about 3 topics in the future that I thought were important, but there are astonishing number of challenges in the data world and sharing research data, and not the least of which is that a lot of data exists on floppy drives and other legacy hardware. So I'm not going to get into each and every one of those. Instead, I want to talk about how do we start to approach these big, grand challenges in this space. And one of the possible solutions that I'm fond of is multi-institutional collaboration, or really collaboration in general. It doesn't have to be multi-institutional, but there's an effort undergoing, effort at OCLC, currently ongoing, to look at library collaboration as a strategic choice. And there's a first report out about it right now, written by Brian Lavoie. And it really talks about the trade-offs of collaboration and why you might collaborate and why you wouldn't collaborate. And I think this is largely spurred by either a reduction in resources that libraries have, or flat resources, or increase in expectations around libraries. So it's essentially, how are we expected to provide more services or different services when there's not necessarily an additional addition of resources? And particularly in evolving spaces and emerging spaces, we sometimes don't know what we're going to need. So how do you even predict this? How do you even start to approach these big problems? So I didn't join the OCLC library collaboration effort until they started looking at research data management. They're using research data management as an example to look at collaboration and trade-off between institutions. I'm thrilled to have been able to join them a couple years ago, and we got to interview people at 3 different large multi-institutional collaborations: the Data Curation Network, the Texas Data Repository, and Portage, which is currently known as the Digital Research Alliance of Canada. So essentially, we chatted with lots of individuals just to find out what was working, what didn't work, what's required to have a successful collaboration. And we're still writing up these results. It's a lot of interview transcripts, so this is not the main finding of this particular endeavor, but I wanted to present it here because it's such a fantastic quote. And honestly, it ties really nicely in with this idea of data communities and the social side of working with data that is profound, but kind of squishy, hard to define and hard to articulate. So this is by Dr. Herbert from Texas A&M. And he says, library consortiums like this need to champion the social side as much as they champion the IT side, because it is on the social side that really makes the Texas Digital Library work so well. Just so you know, the Texas Digital Library is the parent of the Texas Data Repository. My colleagues really enjoy collaborating with TDL. They get credit for collaborating with TDL. They see it as part of their main mission. They enjoy it thoroughly. And really, the group has really moved things forward. And I love this quote because it started to encapsulate what I have heard elsewhere and personally experienced. We heard in other interviews people say that they love their jobs. And that, I think, is kind of profound. I was watching a webinar from ICPSR the other day of data curators talk about how they curate data. And there was a question at the end for the curators that said, what's the most interesting data set you've ever worked with? And the answer was just fantastic and reflected this commitment to enjoying the work. She said, well, the data set was about rape, and she cares deeply about preventing rape. And so as a data curator, she felt that she can contribute to preventing rape. And that's what I have experienced as well, is when you're working with data sets that align with your personal values, it can be quite meaningful to do the work. And the people doing this work are quite dedicated to it. So multi-institutional collaborations, I think, on a functional level are a really good way to attack these great big challenges. But I wanted to point out that even within collaborations, you get these communities of people that are really rally around things that they care about. And I've found other threads of this in other works. So Christine Borgman, in her book, Big Data, Little Data, No Data, Scholarship in the Networked World, she pointed out that by examining the roles that data play in collaborations, the boundaries, scope, agreements, and disagreements of communities come into view. So I haven't quite settled on exactly what the mechanism is, but what I do know from personal experience and from evidence from these other things is that when you work with data, you're getting granular enough and you're working with groups of people that are very intent driven, that they are they're these fluid communities that come together around a particular topic, and you really start to see people's commitment to what they're doing research-wise. And I personally have found that very rewarding. I think there's other aspects of my job that are much more transactional, that are not nearly as rewarding. Now, granted, some of those other aspects are not as challenging either. So I hope that some of you who may have been a little bit intrigued by data librarianship takes this to heart and starts looking at things that you might really enjoy. So I've got a few minutes left here, and I just wanted to point out a couple of roles you can play if you're interested. If I have intrigued you with what you've been told so far, how do you find your own community, right? Especially if you are one of those individuals who are working in an institution where maybe there's not other data people around or data librarians around. First, I highly recommend, if you haven't done any work with data, maybe getting your feet wet with some training just to give you the language, just to give you a little bit of comfort level and some background. I know the National Library of Medicine offers some training. The Medical Library Association has the Data Services Specialty. Those are both great places to look for training opportunities. Also, there's an association called the Research Data Access and Preservation Association. This was the first professional association that I joined as a data librarian, where I really found my people. They have lovely opportunities at their conferences just to do little lightning talks, to throw out an idea. Get lots of really smart people will come and give you feedback and help you out, help you develop and get ideas that are realistic and practical and really help move you forward. And last but certainly not least, if you're interested in the topics and reading the articles and case studies that have been done, a lot of them are in the general library literature, but also the Journal of eScience Librarianship, I think, focuses the most on data librarianship. If you are looking for something a little more close to home, I think there are some strategies you can use to navigate to people in your own organization or institution that might be doing data that might be it might take a little more effort to find. So I loosely categorize these groups as the research administration group, the library group, and the IT group. The research administration, I will say that the names of their groups change a lot from institution to institution or even within institutions as reorgs happen. But in general, you're looking for people that they're either working with the grants and the private funding that require these data policies to be met. They're usually very open to talking about data and researchers and sort of where there's gaps for services. Or the compliance group, and that's specifically because there is, with research misconduct, a lot of it can be traced back to problems with data. In fact, there's a blog online called Retraction Watch that talks about articles that have been retracted and why. And if you do a quick search there for data, you will find about a third of the posts on that blog have to do with data issues. So they're always keenly interested in people that will help keep their graduate students, keep their researchers out of hot water by having better data practices. And then the institutional review board. So institutional review boards are typically at universities and colleges, and they oversee human subjects research. Sometimes they can be quite large, sometimes they have multiple ones. But the important part here is you don't have to work at a university in order to sit on this board. In fact, they specifically set aside slots for people that have no science background from the community because they want this to be a well-rounded evaluation of how human subjects are treated. And a lot of that does have to do with how their data is treated. So if you have the opportunity to become involved with that, I think it's fascinating work. It can be quite intense, but absolutely fascinating work to see what's going on and to have that voice at the table about data ethics or including underrepresented community voices, that sort of thing. Of course, within the library, if you do have a larger library, you might have someone running the DMP tool, which are templates to meet those funder policy requirements around data. Someone teaching data literacy or running a data repository, those are kind of easy people to approach to say, hey, I'm interested in data or data communities, like what's going on here, where might I be able to learn more? And last but certainly not least are the IT groups. IT is on the front line of data writ large. They are also on the front line of research data, even if they don't always know it. So you don't have to have a supercomputing group or lab notebook software. All of IT is dealing with data storage. I will say, when I have initially approached IT groups about data management, the reaction can sometimes be like, well, why are you here? We do data management. We have classes on data management. We don't understand why the library is approaching us about it. And so I clarify and I say, oh, you guys do the technical side, the infrastructure side of data management. I focus on the people. I do the data community side. I do the human side. And at that point in time, I usually get rewarded by great big smiles because they're always really happy for anyone to help with the human side of data management. So those are just a few ideas about how to get involved in data. I hope that something in this talk has spurred some curiosity. I see some answers coming in on the Padlet that is set up, and hopefully we have some questions coming in. I did just want to leave you with just a couple of thoughts, and then we'll go to taking questions. So first, please don't try and go it alone. I think I tried that for years and it's terribly isolating. So please reach out, partner up with someone locally or even someone not locally. It's worth it. And I think learning as a group is fantastic. Even if you can't form your own data community, you can have your own little microcosm of data. Perfect is the enemy of the good. And this is something I talk to researchers a lot about. They want to sort of have it be a one and done. Data sharing. And that is usually not possible given our technological or otherwise constraints, right? We have not, this is an emerging field. We don't even know all the questions yet, let alone have all the answers. So just getting someone to the next, a next step better practice is my goal. And I articulate that. I say, look, in this workshop, we're just going to figure out what your next step is to get a little bit better. And if we keep doing that, we will improve incrementally. Again, align it with your personal interests if possible. I think that has been very rewarding for a number of us and will continue to be so. And if you can, seek organizational support. And I know that this last one is really difficult given various budgets and circumstances, but if you can get organizational support in moving into this space, I think it makes it much easier. Funding to attend workshops or to take training is important. So those are my final thoughts. I'm happy to take any questions you might have at this time. I'm going to be thrilled to look at this Padlet and see what people have written.
So thank you so much, Amanda. And that was very interesting. And for those of you that don't know, data is near and dear to my heart. Anyway, I'm Diane Babsky. I'm the Associate Director for Library Operations at the National Library of Medicine. And I'm going to have a conversation with Amanda now with some of the questions that have come up. So one of the first things that people want to know is, from your experience transitioning from a researcher to a data science librarian, what are some of the strategies that you would suggest? And I noticed you put up some communities and some training opportunities, and really how to start a conversation. But what are some other strategies or just 101 advice that you would provide to other librarians that wanted to get involved with researchers and in data communities?
So thinking back to when I was a researcher, in 2011, when I was a brand new librarian and I was coming into data librarianship, if you had asked me what strength I was bringing into that space, I would have said my technical skills, my statistics skills. I have a strong background in statistics and I love it. And I would have said, oh, I have, technical skills that I can bring to help researchers. 2022 me would disagree entirely. So over the years doing it, it's not the technical skills that I bring to the table. Those can be hired or farmed out, or they have frameworks in which they can tackle that. It's really the reference interview. And I know this, I've said this before and people are like, oh no, you can't be. And I'm like, no, the reference interview is key to this. And here is why. If you ask a researcher about their data, it can be a little bit confusing because of all these definitions, right? What exactly data is. If you ask them about their research, they will immediately start talking about the data and the context around it. So I started every conversation with a new researcher of, tell me about your research. And then my job doing the reference interview was to pull out from what they were saying, what is data management, and what their challenges are around that, and what resources we had to meet those challenges. So it sounds overly simplistic, I think, but it's actually an art form. It's really difficult to do well. And I would strongly recommend to take most librarians have really strong research reference interview skills, and start there. Start with your strengths. Talking to them about it, and then you kind of start to see opportunities as you go. And a number of your interactions might be pretty transactional, like I need a data repository. Okay, we'll look them up. We'll get you a data repository. But if you have that conversation in such a way that it leaves open-ended questions, you'll start to see other areas. For me, recently, I've realized I don't connect up my data communities enough. I got to see sort of a real life 2 different data research groups start to compare information. Never would have thought of connecting them together. This was part of that NSF data curation and SNR leveraging data communities. And I had never really seen this before, that if I just put these research groups together virtually, they start to really self-organize and self-resolve issues that I was struggling to find resources for. So that's something I'm going to carry forward to start doing as well, a little bit more of. So I don't know if did that answer the question?
It did. So
okay.
let me ask another little follow-on to that. So you talked about doing an intake interview, and is there a group or organization that you turn to, kind of like a phone a friend, like maybe that research is just not in your wheelhouse and you're like, I don't even know what that word meant. So how do you help to get up to speed? I mean, I know where my niche is, and, so do you have that built into your own organization, or do you know how to reach out for that?
So I think that varies depending on what resources you have, but I will say that being really upfront with researchers works really, really well. The nature of research is that it has never been done before, so it's all experimental. If you frame what you're doing in that same way, so when things come up and you don't know what they're talking about, which happens all the time, right? Suddenly they're talking about a software or a data type, or even just a goal. And you're like, why would you ever do that with data? Why would you want it behind a paywall in a third world country, or whatever it is that's going on? Be polite, but be really honest about it and be like, I have never run into that before, but you know what? I would love to look into that. And I'm going to get back with you. If you can tell me more, let's work on this together. That's how you become part of a data community, right? Mm-hmm. Is you approach it in the same way that they are. And then you go off, and I personally am part of the RDAP has a listserv that people frequently post to. The data curation network has a number of data curation primers. So if it's like, how do I curate this particular part of type of data, you can look that up. And people are very friendly, so they're very happy to talk about these kinds of challenges. It kind of depends on what the question is. I will reach out to my IT people a lot, because a lot of the issues are IT related. So, I'm trying to put a data or I want to share with a researcher, but not every researcher, and I want it to have these legal, boundaries on it, is one where I will reach out to our copyright librarian, who's fantastic about saying, you can't copyright that, you have to go this other route. And in turn, sometimes we end up in like the tech commercialization office with a lawyer. So it's hard to predict where you're going to go to find the answer, but I think it's really important to be upfront with the researcher about what you know and what you don't know, and just be willing to go find out. That is being part of their community. That's how you start to become included in their research group, whether it's, kind of more accredited or ad hoc inclusion. I will say that if you are helpful, and sometimes you can't be, but if you are helpful, that word of mouth spreads really fast. Yeah. And suddenly everybody wants to talk to you, which is nice, but sometimes overwhelming. So.
It is. Yeah. So I wanted to just throw a comment out from the Padlet, and it says, thank you so much, Amanda. Really a great lecture. And she said, or he, I'm not sure who, it was anonymous, sorry. Data librarianship is something new to us in Africa, but your lecture has elicited a lot of interest in me. So you've had a global impact today. And so let me ask you another kind of a question. A lot of the things that we pointed to today were, more on the North American side. Anything with a global perspective that you could share for this person that they might find beneficial?
So this came up actually at a conference. I apologize, I can't remember exactly which conference, a couple of years ago, about how North American centric a lot of the information is out there on this topic and how problematic that is. And we had a number of people, kind of try and come up with solutions. I'm not sure we had any great solutions right there on the spot, but essentially, a lot of data management and data sharing has been driven by federal policy, and federal policy is really only, our policy is only applicable to us, right? So I would be fascinated to know if any of the social side of what I was talking about, data communities, becoming part of a community, do other cultures, do other communities sort of form the same way we do? Like, is research done the same way? Essentially, I honestly don't know, and I'm part of a number of international research projects, so I feel like I ought to know. Yeah, I would love to see that work done, or even just to hear back anecdotally if anyone's worked with data communities in other countries or other kinds of research. Do you think that any of these definitions that were presented today resonate? Because I do think that in particular, when you don't have the same requirements to meet, here in the US, the funding pressure is so high that there can be a lot of stress around these policies. And that's a role that you can play. You can step in and reduce that stress. But if you're in a country that doesn't have that circumstance, why would they share openly? I would like to think there'd be other motivations about advancing science and benefiting, but I don't know. So I don't think I have any particular insight into an international context around science and open data sharing, except to say that I hope that it's actually, I hope that other countries don't have to go through the same sort of growth pains that we have and don't have the same barriers up. As well, I hope that our technological resources, and specifically our data repositories, would be open to everyone. Let's carry that open to the degree that it's not just us opening to ourselves. Let's put it that way. And honestly, I'll use COVID-19 again as the reason for this. A lot of the problems we're working on, societal, disease, otherwise problems, are universal. They're not limited just to us. So why would we lock that data up? We would want everyone to be able to work on it. And hopefully we'll be able to facilitate other people's data sharing as well, so we can learn.
So let me just, and I think this is the last question for you before we run out of time, but so you just piqued my interest with that, I hope they don't have to learn, and also bringing up the global pandemic and data coming out of that. So what is, as a data science librarian, how do you help facilitate the use of standards right from the beginning of the data life cycle?
So much like any information seeking, if you come to the librarian early, it's better. I will say a fair amount of my work in data librarianship has been what I kind of call data salvage. It's sort of at the last minute, I need to meet this request for information, say from the grant panel, and we have 8 days to respond to this data need, or that kind of thing. And that's great. I mean, that's a role that's very valuable. But it doesn't allow for a lot of really thorough, well-designed data management and sharing. So that's where standards come in. If you can get there ahead of time, you can ensure there's a metadata schema that's used that's appropriate for that data set and is realistic, because I'll be honest, a lot of people don't fill out entire schemas. Mm-hmm. And in fact, I've worked with a couple of research communities where they've said, look, we coordinate this data around this particular project. I'll use the example of there was a dam that was removed on a river. And so there was data coming in from state agencies, from homeowners communities, from, of course, academic researchers, from, I think, at least 5 different institutions, all sort of in different areas. And they were like, they had a data manager, which was fantastic. But the complaint was, you couldn't get the researchers and the various entities to actually fill out all the fields. And that's when you start talking about, data use agreements, or standard operating procedures, or even using the technology to say you have to fill out this field before you can do that. And that's really very operational, but I think that's, you see a lot of that conversation about human behavior around data. And I think that's an indication that we don't have the data culture where people automatically understand why it's important, say, to put a unit on a measurement, right? So yeah, if you can get there early and get that built in, you have so much easier on the other end when you're sharing, and vastly easier to reuse the data as well. So you'll see there's entire sort of communities in library and data librarianship that talk about that, and that's a great place for any cataloger or archivist to chime in.
Indeed. Well, Amanda, I want to thank you again. I see we're at the top, but we're actually a minute over. So thank you so much. This was a great lecture, and I hope it's inspired some of our viewers to get involved in some data communities today. So thank you. And we'll be looking at the questions and going through some of the things that came up in the Padlet with you as well.
Great.
Have a great day, everyone. And thank you for coming and joining us today.